Hello, everyone. Hope you are having an amazing day. Welcome to In Colour, hosted by myself, Hamish, where I interview individuals from a variety of professions to get to know these people on a more personal level. Wherever you're listening from, I hope you are having a great day. Hope the weather's all good. In England, it's a bit cloudy, but oh well, that's all good. So for this episode, I've been joined by another amazing individual, a guy called David Allen Schlaefer. He is a diplomat, author, and globetrotter. And you may be wondering, what is that? So we'll definitely find out a bit more about this. You know, he's been across the world, living in Hong Kong, Tokyo, Bucharest, Kiev, and Mexico, as well as serving alongside the 3rd Brigade Combat Team in Iraq, where he won a Commander's Award for civilian service. So he's been around the world, this person. And he's also currently the Deputy Coordinator for Counterterrorism and Acting Deputy Special Envoy for the Global Coalition to defeat ISIS. And prior to that, he was the director of the Global Coalition's Executive Secretariat. Away from his diplomatic duties, however, he has a deep fascination with mythology and has written The Mark of the Bear Clan. But for today, we really want to understand David away from his career as a diplomat and away from his writing duties, and to really understand what really got him on this journey. Why did he want to become a diplomat, and where has his fascination for mythology came from? So let's find out, why did David become involved in global diplomacy? So David, thank you first of all for coming on to In Colour, and hope you're doing well.
I am. Thanks, Hamish. It's a real pleasure to meet you and to be with you today.
No, really massive pleasure, massive pleasure. So, what influenced you then to get involved in global diplomacy?
Yeah, it's kind of a funny story because I grew up in Texas, way down in South Texas, right at the Texas-Mexico border, in an area that was a very isolated, geographically distant, kind of culturally distant part of the United States, and about as far away from Washington, D.C. or New York City or these kind of big centers of culture in the United States as one could get. Actually grew up on a citrus farm until I was about 5 years old, and moved into the city, so to speak, which was like a town of, 25,000, 30,000 at the time, only when I was in elementary school. But I think that was part of it. I think that even from a very early age, seeing things in television, seeing things in books about the wider world, being in this very small and again, very geographically isolated area, it just made me dream of that wider world, so to speak. And even when I was a little kid, first grade, second grade, third grade, I would try to get my hands on any book, any magazine, anything that I could see about the world at large, and just devour it absolutely. And then I think for me, the moment that really kind of pushed me into a career in international diplomacy was through a book, no big surprise. And it was a book by an American author. His name is Henry Wouk, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, W-O-U-K. And he wrote a couple of books called The Winds of War and War and Remembrance, which were real bestsellers back in the 80s and the 90s. There was even a television miniseries, and it basically followed the lives of this family through the Second World War, both in Europe, the Holocaust, the war in the Pacific. And there was a character in that book. There was a Foreign Service officer. His name was Leslie Sloat. I remember that to this day. And of course, he had this fantastical life, and he was stationed in, Berlin right before the war begins. He's in Moscow when, the German troops are literally at the gates after Operation Barbarossa. He parachutes into France later. He was a minor character, but his adventures were absolutely amazing. And he was always right there at certain historical moments as a diplomat when all these amazing things were taking place. I had no idea what the Foreign Service was before I read this. I think I was in 8th grade. I was vaguely aware maybe of what, embassies were and what diplomats were. But that was it. When I read that and I read that character, it was so fascinating. I think that's what set me down the path and down the road to that kind of career. I learned everything I could about it. Started getting interested in college programs and university programs that I would be able to apply to that had a focus in diplomacy. And I just pursued that path, and was fortunate enough to get appointed all the way back in 1994. It seems like a very long time at
Wow.
this point,
Oh
but
my God.
yeah, I've been in the Foreign Service since then. I'm one of these people who I've never done anything else, right? I went straight out of school, right into the diplomatic corps, so never had a real job, so to speak, except for, delivering pizza and working at McDonald's and stuff like that when I was in college or in high school. And that was it. I think it was a combination of that upbringing in an isolated area where stories about the world at large and about diplomats and about people that were traveling just meant everything to me as a child, given that my own experience, while very rich and, in many ways, and I had a wonderful family, and, I love Texas, I love that area, again, it was still a distant experience and an isolated experience. Those glimpses were my way of kind of connecting with the larger world. And then when I had the opportunity to go into the Foreign Service, I was able to kind of realize that dream. And subsequently, I've never lived anywhere more than 4 years, I think, at a stretch for the past 30 years or so.
Wow, and it sounds incredible that you've been a global diplomat since 1994, and it's like that's like what? That's like I'm like 3 years. That's 3 years before I was born. So I'm so
It's
young right now. It's crazy in that
it's
sense.
amazing. Yeah, makes
Yeah,
me dates me. It definitely does. But
definitely
yeah,
doesn't it?
almost 3 decades. It's the truth.
Almost. That's which is incredible. And you spoke a lot about influences, about books, and how that's made you want to become in the global diplomacy scene. What specifically about those books did you really enjoy, and that made you really inspired to become a global diplomat? Was there certain like values that those books had that really thought, you know what, those values really connect to me, and that's why I really want to become a global diplomat? In that
Yeah,
sense.
I think it was kind of an emphasis, let's say, on multiculturalism, really, as I began
Mm,
to study and learn more and more about, both differences and similarities, right? There are human
mm,
similarities that bind everyone together. I personally believe they are much, much stronger than any cultural differences or economic differences or social differences. That was something that I think I kind of keyed into at a very early age. And I think that's something that's been confirmed by my experience as a diplomat. But again, just that amazing mosaic and tapestry of human experience, from belief systems and religions to attire and dress and music and food. That diversity is so incredible, and having an opportunity to experience that and to do so through a career like this where you're serving your country, and that's certainly a
mm,
really big motivation, right? I think for any foreign service officer, for anyone in the military, trying to serve your country, do something good for your society and for your people is a big part of it too. And I think that those are the experiences and the drivers that kind of pushed me and led me into what I've done.
absolutely. And when you talk about serving your country, does that ever, as a diplomat, is that quite a big pressure for you? Do you ever feel the pressure of serving your country as a diplomat at all,
Yeah,
or not
absolutely.
really?
Yeah, no,
Mm,
you do all the time. Absolutely.
yeah.
It can be sometimes the smallest issues that you're working on, or issues that have a real existential type of nature. I think that, the philosophy that I try to employ as a diplomat on a daily basis is every single day, I hope that there's at least one thing that I do that really makes a positive difference in
Mm,
terms of U.S. diplomacy. Maybe that's something very small, extremely small, brokering an agreement on, a basic issue about a press engagement that's going to provide an opportunity to talk about, refugee issues in Northeast Syria and the IDP camps there. Maybe it can be something extraordinarily large, like actually being part of agreement for a major international treaty between the Japanese and the United States, let's say, on American force posture and military posture in Japan, which I was a part of. Just these last couple of days, I've been in Rome, where I was participating in the Global Coalition to Defeat ISIS ministerial meeting. 83 foreign ministers gathering, the largest gathering that we've had since the pandemic began. And also in some side meetings related to the G20. Again, very huge things. So some of these are on a very big scale, some are on a very small scale. I think regardless of the scale, you always feel that, that push behind you, that responsibility that you have to try to do your best. And I'll say, Hamish, I think also a part of that is, I am very aware as a diplomat and as a foreign service officer that I'm a public servant, right? My salary, whatever it is coming from, taxpayers' coffers, right? These are from the public coffers. And I think that you feel a great sense of responsibility to do your best and to just, push and push as hard as you can because of that. Because this life does afford so many opportunities and privileges. There are really tough parts of it as well. And, there can be dangerous situations that you're in, and also just the itinerant vagabond kind of lifestyle, it's not easy. It has an impact upon your life, and you never get some of that back. But you do enjoy this incredible privilege, again, of those experiences that I mentioned, the multicultural experience, the diversity of experience, and your family is able to enjoy that as well and be enriched by it. And I think of that, especially during the bad times, always try to think of that, realize how fortunate I am to have the opportunity to engage in this work and this lifestyle. And I think that informs that sense of responsibility to just do my absolute best, if at all possible, in every single engagement that I have, large or small, to try to do, a little bit of something that is good and that pushes the ball down the field and advances the ball down the field just a little bit further.
Completely. It's like even like another saying, it's like pushing like a snowball effect and like going up and up and up
Absolutely.
and up and stuff like that. Absolutely. And it's just to touch on your like career as a diplomat, I find with lots of like careers and professions, there's lots of like say like preconceptions or misconceptions. And as a diplomat, I feel like there's a lot of like misconceptions about being a diplomat in that sense. So, going around the world, traveling around, it's an amazing experience, but sometimes you might have to be, doing lots of important stuff, and sometimes even being homesick and things like that. So what I really want to understand is like, what's it really like traveling around the world, like as a diplomat, or like what's it actually like being a diplomat, would you say?
Yeah, I think the best way to answer that question is that every single tour that you have as a diplomat, and we describe an assignment, let's say, 2 years in London, 2 years in Phnom Penh, 3 years in Helsinki, whatever, we usually use a tour, as in the phrase tour of duty. Every tour that you have is going to be completely different. So your career at its end is not going to be one experience, but it's going to be this composite of 8 or 9 or 10 different jobs, let's say, that you have had throughout that entire period. Sometimes you will have a tour, particularly if it is in a challenging area, where in effect, what you are doing is the same thing that someone that is in an NGO would be doing. I mentioned refugee issues earlier. You may be stationed in Northeast Syria, working as a type of liaison officer in refugee and internally displaced persons camps, working with implementers who are attempting to provide basic infrastructure, basic education services to tens of thousands of individuals that are trapped in these camps. You may find yourself conversely in a Berlin or in a Tokyo, working on a completely different set of issues at a different level. Issues related to global international security policy and military force posture. Issues related to the United Nations and international organizations. It's going to be different everywhere you are, not just in terms of the culture and, the scenery, the language, but in terms of the issue set that you're working with. So I've had an opportunity, for example, to give you some more concrete examples of having a couple of tours where trafficking in persons was a major issue that I was working on, basically talking about the trafficking of women and children, women and girls, for the purposes of sexual exploitation from Eastern Europe, from Russia, from the former Soviet space, Romania, Bulgaria, Ukraine, etc., into Western Europe, to a lesser extent into the United States, as sex trafficking. Right, the girls are trafficked; they're forced to work in prostitution or something like that, etc. Huge problem, human trafficking. There were other aspects and dynamics, labor trafficking as well. Still a big problem in 2021. I've worked very closely with law enforcement officials, with international organizations, with the OSCE, with other similar types of institutions, and a wide range of projects, both aimed at demand reduction and breaking up the trafficking rings, at rescue type NGOs, so that girls that are in trouble are able to reach out and connect with someone and get in touch with someone. Programs that are aimed at stopping the problem at its source, let's say, programs that are aimed at orphanages and institutions and things like that, where typically a lot of these girls will be recruited in Eastern Europe or in Russia when they're 15, 16, 17, and kind of groomed and then taken into this. Absolutely fascinating, hard stuff, right? This is really difficult stuff to work with when you get involved in actual cases and case studies. On the other hand, I've been involved, I made a reference to when I was in Tokyo, negotiations over the span of about 18 months between the United States and the Japanese on something that we call the U.S.-Japan Defense Guidelines, basically kind of a roles, missions, and capabilities agreement between the U.S. and Japan in the case of some type of a security situation, security crisis, something in the East Asia Pacific region. You can think of North Korea scenario, missile launches, things like that. Very, very different issue set, very technical, very existential. And again, that was a process that took place over a period of about 18 months or so. So every tour a little bit different, every issue set a little bit different, depending on where you are or what your job is at the embassy that you're assigned to. And it's one of the best things about the life. It's one of the best things about the career. Again, you don't have just one career, but you're kind of reinventing yourself, not only culturally or linguistically by learning another language or simply going to another place, but you are reinventing your subject matter expertise and the issues that you are working on literally every single place that you go. And it's fascinating. I think you do develop a breadth of knowledge that maybe some journalists, will begin to maybe some develop that, over time, and a few other occupations like that. But I don't think that there are many other opportunities people have to work on such a wide range of issue sets as you do as a diplomat.
No, it sounds like it. It sounds like you've learned so much, and I feel like that's maybe one of the lessons you've learned so much from being a diplomat, is the fact that you've learned so many different skills, so many different experiences, and so many different issues that I think maybe not many people have that experience, which sounds incredible. And I think that's it's a privilege in itself to have those experiences and have those lessons. And a question for me, actually, I was really have thought about in my head is what's been, because you've been on lots of tours. If you don't mind me asking this, like what's been the most challenging tour you've actually had experience yourself during your time as a global diplomat?
Yeah, definitely it was my time in Iraq.
Really?
I was, as you mentioned, attached to a military element. It was primarily the 3rd Brigade Combat Team while I was there. I was part of something called the Provincial Reconstruction Team, and we were working down in the southern part of Iraq, working with the government, working with NGOs, working on education infrastructure, on hardcore infrastructure like electrical generation plants, working on human infrastructure, humanitarian assistance, elections and governance, and teaching about the electoral process, getting women registered to vote in the initial Iraqi elections. But there was still a lot of kinetic activity, as we call it, that was going on then. Atypical experience for a diplomat. I was in a sniper incident, lots of rocket attacks and mortar attacks and things like that. Those were somewhat ubiquitous. There was one individual from my team that was killed. We did lose somebody in November of 2009. He was killed on one of our missions, one of our PRT missions, in a sniper attack. And I think that was the most difficult moment that I had as a diplomat. Both being impacted by that personally, because I knew this young man, and so it was a personal tragedy. being impacted by it professionally because we had a mission, right? And we were a team and we had to continue and we had to keep going and push on. We had incredibly important lines of effort that we were working on. You couldn't just stop, right? If you did, the wheels were going to come off. It was that kind of dynamic. You needed to keep, riding that bicycle, as it were, and not hesitate. I think both finding the strength in myself to continue, but also I was in a leadership position at that time, modeling the kind of reaction and behavior that I hope to see, and keeping our team together and keeping it functioning at a very high level. And we had a pretty small PRT. It was only about 13 people, so this wasn't some element of 100 people or whatever. Everyone knew one another quite well. This was one of our military support guys. That was definitely the biggest challenge that I have faced, that type of existential adversity, and just keeping those wheels moving and keeping things on track after an incident like that. That's not the typical thing that you do as a diplomat. You may see a lot of bad things as a diplomat. If you're a consular officer in particular, you're going to be involved in cases of American citizens dying overseas, right? In a variety of ways, being horribly injured. You're making notification calls to next of kin. You need to come get your loved one. They're in the hospital, or maybe they passed away. I think that we all have a lot of stories and tales at the end of the day along those lines. But for me, that one, in Iraq, in that combat kind of situation with the ongoing mission, I think about it all the time. I think we recovered. I think we did well. I'm proud of the way that the team held together. But I never forget that young man, and I never will. And he's a real hero. And that's something that has informed so many other decisions that I've made, personally and professionally, something that really stays with me from day to day.
No, I just want to say, I'm very sorry to hear that you had someone who's really close to you, lost his life. I'm so sorry. That is so, God, that hits really, really hard. And I think that's sometimes the side of global diplomacy that doesn't really get mentioned. It's the fact that on duty, you might lose someone very close to you.
Yeah.
And sometimes that doesn't really get mentioned that much within being a global diplomat. And I think that's something that I think, and thank you, by the way, for sharing that. So I think that must be a lot to kind of share. Yeah. And did that take a long, if this is a bit of a personal question, you can just tell me, was that quite a lot in terms of mentally quite difficult to kind of overcome that loss, or was it?
Yeah, it was. Yeah. And I think one way that we overcame it, and I think many people do this in a variety of crisis situations, you're sick or you're ill, you get a horrible medical diagnosis, is routine, right? Kind of sticking with routine and here's the agenda for tomorrow. And, we're doing this at 9, we're doing this at 11, we're doing this at 15:30, we're doing this at 700, and we're doing it. We're not going to let this stop us. I think a big part of overcoming that in the immediate moment was just pushing right on through. But I think it is something that, sticks with you, obviously, for a long time. And, that was a sense of loss. But, another way to answer your question, Hamish, and I've spoken with so many other diplomats about this, American and other diplomats too, some British diplomats as well. We do live this life of privilege in a very real sense of being able to travel around so much and live in so many different places. It's amazing. But the flip side of that coin is that you live a very atypical life of constantly moving, constantly leaving, constantly reinventing yourself. You have friends that are scattered all over the world, but compared to most people who live in one place or maybe a handful of places over the course of their life, I think that most people develop a depth of friendship and personal relationships that you don't have as a diplomat, except with your immediate family, your spouse, your partner, your children, if you have children. Moving around like you do, hardly ever being in your home country, right? And hardly ever being in the United States, never staying anywhere more than 2-3 years or whatever. Again, there is just a depth of living alongside in physical proximity to the people that you love, your friends, your family, your parents, that most people take for granted and that we do not have. and you're never going to get that back, right? That is irreplaceable. It's not like you're going to
Mm.
retire when you're 65 or whatever, and I'll catch up on that.
Yeah.
Those are experiences that people have over the course of a lifetime. And when that window is closed, it is closed. And again, I've spoken with quite a few colleagues about that, for all of the great things that go on and all of the privileges, let's say. The ultimate loss that you have, or the sacrifice, let's say, that you make, that's what it is. It's just that day-to-day contact, friends, family, people that you love, literally never seeing them, some of them for
Mm.
a decade at a time. In my situation, I'm an only child. So, I'm what my parents have, right?
Yeah.
And while most people just, if their parents are alive and they're lucky enough to have their parents, take for granted seeing them anytime they want, probably living in the
Mm.
same area, certainly visiting them multiple times for a year. That's something that, I've gone, a couple of years at a time without seeing them. I'm their only child, and I have lived this life abroad where, they never anticipated that, seeing me so periodically, episodically. Yes, there's Facebook and there's social media and telephones and all that, and all of that
It's
is
not the same though,
wonderful.
isn't it?
It's not the same. Yeah.
No.
And I think that is the biggest sacrifice probably that we make. And again, another way to answer your question about the most difficult experience, maybe it's not a singular experience, it's the totality or the collectivity of that whole dynamic of the itinerant lifestyle. You gain a lot, but make no mistake, it comes at a price. I'm not saying I would change, my decision
Mm.
and not go into the foreign service. I wouldn't do that. But the older that I get, I'm more and more aware of that dynamic. I become very aware of it, actually, as my career goes on and as I get older. And it does make for a certain bittersweetness or melancholy type of feeling when you reflect upon your life.
Yeah, totally. I mean, this is why In Color exists, really, is to really share these experiences, to really showcase that actually being a diplomat or whatever job it is, it's not as black and white as it is. It's actually very colorful. Like, you can have the amazing experience where you help someone in another country, like, for example, what you've been doing in Iraq, for example, right? You can really help that situation out. There's also times where you sometimes reflect and think you're very homesick. You can't see your family, for example, in America. But you also understand that actually it's a really big privilege, the fact that I'm traveling around the world and also
Mhm.
helping so many communities around the world, which is why In Color exists, is to really showcase how colorful, pun intended, your experiences are, and I think that's so important for people to listen to and to understand that actually being a diplomat, as much as you can travel around the world, as much as you can really interact with so many different types of cultures and so many different types of people, there's also the flip side, which can be very lonely and very distressing. That, I think, is what I'm gathering from you, really, which is, I think, is
Yeah.
such a good way to kind of understand it from a diplomat sense. It's super, super interesting. And
Best
what
of
also,
times and worst of
yeah,
times.
yeah, I think a really good way to kind of reflect on it. And what I also want to reflect on, because you're not just a diplomat, actually, you're also a writer, and you've actually got this fascination for mythology, which is really interesting, actually, because I know my dad actually has read some mythologies as well, actually. So he's been talking a bit about it with me. And also, you've wrote the Mark of the Bear Clan as well. So, like, I really want to understand, where has your fascination for mythology kind of came from? I'm really curious about.
Right. Well, it won't be a surprise, given what we've talked about, that it came from a book and a couple of books.
Ah, nice.
And my parents, when I was growing up down in South Texas, they had, this is pre-internet, right? I mean, way back then,
Yeah.
so far before the internet. I was a little kid in the 70s. They had a collection of books, these Time Life series and Reader's Digest series, where they would have these big, glossy kind of hardcover books about mysteries of the world, tales of the unknown, cultures of the world. And I loved these things and I devoured them. And one of them was called Folklore of the World, I believe. And it was
Mm.
basically a book about mythology, Roman mythology, Greek mythology. It went into Native American mythology. I can remember this stuff about Hawaii and the Mini-Hunes and these characters from Hawaiian legend. And then within that book were 3 or 4 pages that dealt with Finland and the Kalevala, which is the Finnish national, epic, this collection of songs, of oral songs, traditions, and histories that a Swedo-Finn named Elias Lönnrot put together in the 19th century, and they became incredibly important in the Finnish language, kind of creating a sense of national identity, and then later to Finnish independence. That's where I came across that. That's where I came across these stories. And after that, again, I just began to read every single thing I could find, from classical, stories about Greek and Roman mythology to everything I could find about Norse mythology in Finland. I was fascinated by the stories themselves, and I think as I became a little bit older and developed a little bit more of a perspective, I think I became fascinated by what I began to realize what the purpose of these stories was, right? I mean, these are basically collective wisdom, cultural wisdom. They are paths or guides that told people this is what your identity is. This is who you are, what your people, what your society, what your culture is, within the world. And this is your role within it. This is how you act. This is how you behave. Here are the values you want to emulate. Here are the dangers and the examples, right? The stories of people who didn't follow the right path, who didn't live according to those values, and what happens to them. That's the commonality, that you see across all of these mythologies. The values may be a little different, although honestly, there is a tremendous amount, I think, of, collective human wisdom, let's say, that is cross-domain, that cuts across all of these, even though they're packaged in ways that are culturally specific and environmentally specific. I think that's what it was that really attracted me to mythology writ large, that sense of all of these different human civilizations at different points in time, developing folklore, not just to explain, why does the sun rise in the east and go, down in the west when we
Yeah.
didn't understand. That's a part of it, sure, but there's something much, much deeper. And I think it's that those signs, those guideposts to life, that importance to identity that mythology was based upon. I think that is the much deeper meaning, and that's really what attracted me to folklore and legend and myth.
So it kind of seems like then from that fascination, it seems it's the values that you take away from those books, from mythology, to actually implement in your life. It seems like if that's the best way to interpret it, is why you got so fascinated by it.
I think that's the case. I think it's definitely informed my life. I think it's really important to know what your convictions are, and to try to have the strength of your convictions in both good times and bad. And when you make important choices in your life, to try to make them within that framework. It's not easy to do. It's very difficult to do. Getting back to my book, The Mark of the Bear Clan, and I appreciate you asking about it. I had the amazing opportunity to serve a really large part of my career in Finland. And I was in Helsinki for more than 4 years. I studied Finnish for an entire year before I went to Finland. I was the only student in the class the entire year,
Really?
just me. Exactly.
No way. That's
Yes.
so fun. That's
40,
so cool.
44 weeks. So a singularly lonely experience, but it was fascinating. And then when I was in Helsinki, it gave me an opportunity to travel around and really immerse myself in Finnish folklore, in the Kalevala. I've always been a big fan of fantasy literature, big a fan of Tolkien, of classic fantasy works like the Earthsea trilogy, the original trilogy by Ursula K. Le Guin, and Chronicles of Narnia, and all of those older seminal fantasy works. And I had always thought, since I am a writer, of wanting to turn to something like that, and so having this amazing experience to maybe not immigrate to Finland, but to live there for a very long period of time, to study the myth, to study the language, to study the Finnish spirit. I embarked upon the Far Northern Land Saga, which is a trilogy as well. The first book, The Mark of the Bear Clan, is the book that you mentioned, and that is a book that has just recently come out. Books 2 and 3 will come out later this year and in early 2022. And what I did is something that, and I keep looking for this, I don't believe that in English literature, it's really been done before, a high epic fantasy that is set in that world, in the world of Finnish myth and folklore, in the world of the Kalevala. So lots of books set in, Norse, mythology, Iceland, the core Scandinavia region, Odin and Loki, and all of that. Those are amazing stories. We all know what those are. Not many people are anywhere near as familiar, if they've ever heard of it, of the Finnish pantheon, and it's completely distinct. The Finns are not, they're a Finno-Ugric people. The language is a Finno-Ugric language, right? It's not a Germanic language, a completely different set of oral traditions. And so the story that I created is set in that world. Many of the characters are the actual traditional characters of Finnish folklore. Vainamoinen. There was actually J.R.R. Tolkien's main input for Gandalf. I mean, that is the origin of Gandalf. And Tolkien himself was greatly affected by the Finnish language and by the Kalevala that he read when he was a student. Lemminkainen, Mielikki, those names don't mean a lot to English speakers, but I hope that some people will be interested in learning more about Finnish folklore and will enjoy a fantasy story that is set in that world. It's a very simple story, very heavily involved in the Finnish magic system, which is a system of songs. Finnish wizards were shamans, and their spells or their incantations were basically songs, and songs about the origin of things that then gave the wizard, the shaman, a power to manipulate it in some way. And the story just starts off very small, the story of a little girl who has a chance encounter and is attacked by a bear, which was very common in Iron Age Finland, and that's the time period we're looking at. And she's saved by this famous culture hero that I mentioned, Vainamoinen. And she's dying, and he basically calls her back from death, and he has to kill the bear in order to save her, and that's taboo. That's something that for those people in the Iron Age at that time, the bear was a totem. It was a culture symbol. It was a sacred animal. And when he does that, there's something from that spirit animal, dying at the same time that the little girl, her name is Ulla, is saved, that goes into her, that transforms her, that sets her down the path that the ancient Finns called the trail for singers. They saw it as a reindeer trail, and that was the phrase that they used, the trail for singers, the path for singers. That is what a shaman or a witch or a wizard would go down. It sets her down that trail. And it sets her down confrontation with, the early Finns' great enemy. For them, it was the personification of winter, and of the elements. It's a witch named Louhi, and the story blooms from there. She travels across Iron Age Finland through different clans, different areas, increasing her knowledge of these fantastical creatures. The Finns have their version of whatever, elves and gnomes. We have English names that we assign to kind of the Germanic, versions, and the Anglo-Saxon versions. The Finns have their own versions. I incorporated all of that, and the world kind of expands for her as she enters this titanic conflict, let's say, that was completely alien to her experience before the encounter with the bear. That's the mark that she has, and that's the mark of the clan. It's a bear claw, where those claws had ripped at her flesh and seriously wounded her. And when she was healed, there was the impression, almost like a tattoo, so perfect and so unusual. That starts off her journey. She gets older as the 3 books go along, so she's not a little girl anymore at the end. But I really wanted to try to tap into these themes that are in Finnish mythology, and it's just the spirit of Finns surviving in that environment, right? That harshest of physical environments. There's a word sisu in Finnish, which translates roughly as like will or relentless determination, especially in a hopeless situation. There may be no hope, right? Your cause is hopeless. Nevertheless, you are undeterred, and you continue to do what you must do from a moral, from an ethical standpoint, irrespective of the consequences. That's what's important, not the outcome necessarily in the physical world. That is at the core of the Finnish, spirit. It's very melancholy, the sense of, loss and the harshness of the environment. I tried to capture that and instill that. That's really what drove me to write this. And I hope, because I love Finland, I love Finnish language and culture so much, that especially for an English-speaking audience, I captured just a little bit of that, and can introduce that to fantasy fans, and to fans of folklore, of myth, of comparative cultures, and maybe they'll move on and read more about it. Maybe some other writers will be inspired, and we'll see, other series that are set, just as we have so many that are set in Norse mythology, and that's great. Maybe it will inspire some other writers to do the same thing, and that would be wonderful too.
100%. I mean, you've been inspired by books that, go into your global diplomacy, and you're also inspired by books to do your mythology, So I feel like books are, it is a very book heavy episode, but in a good way though, with the fact that you can get inspired by so many things like books to really, go on your way in terms of your passions, in terms of what your interests are. So no,
I hadn't thought of it that way, Hamish, but you're absolutely right.
Yeah, it seems like it, right? But no, 100%. But no, honestly, I mean, this has been a really great interview, David, and just want to say massive thank you. I wish I could speak to you for longer, but no, it's been a fantastic interview, and an absolute pleasure just to understand like your journey into terms of like global diplomacy, as well as like really understanding like why you have this fascination for mythology. So it's been a really great pleasure. And where can our audience actually find your book? Because I think you've got a website, so you can just plug in your website.
Exactly. Right. So my website is www.davidschlaefer.com, my name. The book is available, hard copy, ebook, Kindle version on Amazon. So you can go to the website. We've got a beautiful video trailer. Check out the description and some passages there, and just click on Amazon. And I hope everyone enjoys it.
Perfect. Honestly, we'll get that. We'll definitely put that in the bio, and hopefully our audience can check that out. And I think it's been an absolute pleasure, as always, to have David on. And if this is your first time, Common Sense audience, for coming on to In Color, why don't you, like and comment and subscribe to our YouTube channel, as well as, join Common Sense at join.tcsnetwork.co.uk. And until the next episode where I interview another amazing guest from another industry, stay in color.